for me, I did not really consider myself to be an artist, so it's kind of unusual for me to now hold a panel that is tagged as art at a furry convention. But I had this problem that I love plushies. And back in, I think it was 2009 or 2010, a movie came out with a certain dragon character. And maybe you have seen this movie. If you have not, then you missed one of the most beautiful, most, well, transformative movies with dragons in the past century. Of course, I'm talking about How to Train a Dragon. And this is one of the characters in this movie. He's called Toothless and is a Night Fury dragon. And I love this movie, I love dragons, and I love plushies. So I was thinking, okay, this movie was made by DreamWorks, and they are a big company. They should have budget to produce really high quality plushies. They are trying to establish a new franchise, the Dragons franchise, so they need to really put their soul and money into producing merchandise that really captures the audience's imagination in order to really build this fandom. So I was expecting a good dragon plushie that is officially available. But back then, after the first movie released, they looked like this. Or even worse, like this. And I'm not sure about you, but these don't look like Toothless at all. I think the blue one even had like a red one side, so it would roar if you shake it, but it was a very cheap speaker, so it didn't sound like a dragon at all. And it was very, very sad. And in the end, I did not buy one of those plushies. I went, of course, to DeviantArt. Very sad that there are no dragon plushies available of Toothless. But I quickly discovered that artists can do better than the official Dragons franchise. And I went to DeviantArt to an artist called KTA and scrolled through the plushies. A very talented plushie artist, and I saw this submission here for a Toothless plushie, or even two Toothless plushies. And they look already much better than what was officially available. And then I scrolled down and saw this here, tutorial with a link. So I clicked this link, and then I got this submission here, where we have like a Toothless plush tutorial with a list of what materials you need, things to note before you start, and then a step-by-step instruction on, well, how to plush your dragon. And for me, this was more like, I was wondering, like, is this really art? Because it kind of reads more like an IKEA manual. Like, cut out these shapes and then follow these step-by-step instructions to then make your own plushie. So it even had images, and at the end, you could call a small Toothless plushie your own. And I was intrigued. I tried it, and I made my very own first plushie. And this is a picture of that. And I was hooked, because suddenly I had the ability to, well, follow a step-by-step instruction with no really art talent needed, because I have the pattern. And over the years, I made more plushies. But I always came back to Toothless and made better and better versions, until this one is one of my final versions that I have. But of course, if you have the ability to make plushies and plushie patterns, there's no limit what you can do. So of course, I made other plushies too. All right, hello and welcome. I'm Fenmar, and I'll be your host on this How to Make Your Own Plushie Patterns panel here at NordicFuzzCon. Over the last 15 years, I have got some knowledge and experience that I want to share with you in order for you to make the world a fluffier place. you'll notice that this panel is called How to Make Your Own Plushie Patterns. So the majority of the time we will be talking about how to make patterns, but not about how to make plushies themselves. Because this is a skill that is not that easily taught in like a lecture-style setting. This is something you just have to do and get more familiar with. But of course, I don't want to leave you hanging dry. I want you to be able to make your own plushies, because that is the first step if you want to make plushies, and then the second step would be your own patterns. So for this purpose, I can point you to a very valuable resource, which is a blog called So Disney by Jolie Knight. If you're familiar or have made one or two plushies already, you'll be familiar with her blogs. Here you can find free patterns and tutorials for plushies. So when you go to the URL, which is just jolieknight.com, I'll have a QR code up in a second, then you can navigate to the free patterns section, where you find a lot of different plushie patterns available completely for free. They're ranked also by difficulty, so you can kind of get a tutorial and make a simple plushie first, and then slowly work your way up to more complex patterns. So let's, for example, check out this Lapras plushie here. What you get is basically a PDF that contains everything you need to know to get started. Like the difficulty, what materials you need to use, which fabric is suggested, so a little bit of a comparison of different fabrics, and which one would be recommended for the particular plushie and how they relate to when they are sewn. How to print a pattern. So basic steps really, from the very start you'll get guided to make your own plushie, and then of course a lot of images, step-by-step instructions on how to assemble the pattern. As I said, it's basically an instruction manual for building furniture. It's not really, you don't need to be an artist to follow these patterns, and then of course in the end, print at home pattern. So this is Jolie Knight, So Disney, website I wholeheartedly recommend if you want to get started making plushies. Just scan the QR code, bookmark it, and when you're back at home and NordicFuzzCon is sadly over and you feel inspired, I want to make it, I want to make art, then go there, take a pattern, take a plushie that speaks to you, just make it, maybe make two, and then you will get started and get the experience needed to then take the next step to make your own plushie patterns. So, if you want to make your own plushie patterns, where do we get started? Well, professionals, so professional artists, somehow need to make the patterns. So, the first method I want to show you is just looking what do the professionals do, and maybe we can do the same. And here I want to show you a plushie by NasFX.
Yes, NasFX mentioned.
Yes, of course. This beautiful spiral plushie really shook me. Like, this is a plushie, I couldn't even believe it. So beautiful, so detailed, such craftsmanship. And when I saw this submission on DeviantArt, I again scrolled down to the description. Maybe there's a tutorial link to make your own spiral plushie. Unfortunately, no such luck. But she wrote a couple of lines about the process and some comments about the pattern creation process. And I want to highlight this section here. I calculated that almost 300 hours went into making this plushie. If you're wondering why are custom plushies so expensive, this is why. it takes a lot of time to make the pattern. And even here it took 16 to 17 fully sewn hats and 8 fully sewn bodies to achieve this result. So I was stunned. I was like, okay, that's a lot of work. And NASA is a professional. Like, she knows what she's doing. And it still takes a lot of tries. And I was wondering, is this all there is? Is this really just trial and error? So I asked her on Twitter and said, like, is this all there is? Like, do you have any tools of your design a pattern? And she said, no, it's trial and error using my own knowledge and experience. So apparently professionals do it this way. They just know what they are doing. So this is the first method of how to make your own plushie patterns. Oh, this is very big. Sorry about this. Trial and error. Just try stuff and see if it works. And if it doesn't, just throw it away and try again. And again, and again. 16 to 18 times for a finished pattern. And this is with decades of experience. So this was not really a way I wanted to go. I didn't have the experience, nor was I really artistically versed. I'm a software engineer, I'm not an artist. So I really didn't want to do a trial and error approach. During the Corona lockdown, I had some, spare time, and I tried my hands at making a fursuit. And this is a picture of a fursuit, of the fursuit that I made during the Corona lockdown. Thank you. And for this fursuit, you can't see it in this picture for strategic reasons. I needed to make foot paws. I wanted to have like indoor feet paws that are like in this color palette of this griffin, but I didn't know how to do it. And fursuits have the same problem as plushies, like they need a sewing pattern in order to be created. What I had is, years earlier, I bought some very cheap indoor feet paws from Amazon. They looked like this, maybe you have seen them in a listing or so. Terrible quality. I couldn't use it as a feet paws because like the colors all off. They were falling apart after like 2 or 3 times wearing them. But I really liked the initial shape. I like that they have like claws in the front and some padding in the feet paw itself. And I wanted my feet paws to be similar. Not exactly the same. I would use other materials, I would maybe scale them up a bit, but it's very similar to what I already had. So what I did was, I took them apart at the seams, and then I had the sewing pattern for these feet paws, and then I could reassemble them with my own fabric. And this way, I created a higher quality version based on the pattern that I took from an already existing product. So far to fursuits. Now what does this mean for plushies?
Very fitting.
Theoretically,
Very fitting.
if you had a plushie that kind of fits what you want to make, but not quite. Maybe the material is a little bit different than you want it to be, maybe it's too small and you want to make it bigger, then in theory, what you can do is this.
It's part of the song.
You can, of course, take any sewn product apart by its seams, including plushies. And if you are very careful and remember which piece goes where, then you have the sewing pattern. You can use different material and sew it back together. And then you have maybe a duplicate or a slightly modified version of the plushie that you want to make. So this is the second method, taking apart an existing product, modifying it, and then creating something of your own. I call this method, well, reverse engineering. Okay. If you remember, we started this method up by, I wanted to make a fursuit. Quick question, who of you has a fursuit? Awesome, very cool. Who of you has commissioned their full bodysuit from an artist? A lot of people. What do you need to give to the artist for them to make your fursuit, your bodysuit? Yes.
You need to make duct tape dummy.
A duct tape dummy, yes. I was fishing for money. Of course, it's expensive, but of course you need to give them a duct tape dummy. It looks like this if you're not familiar with duct tape dummies. It's basically you cover yourself in tape and then you send this to the artist. So they have a representation of your, well, body proportions in tape. And what the artist then does is they take this duct tape dummy and your reference images, your character sheet, and draw on this duct tape dummy where the seams need to be, where the fabric changes, and then they cut it apart and have the sewing pattern for your body, for your fursuit body. Now, what does this mean for plushies? We don't have a plushie yet, but if we can create a plushie out of a different material, for example, clay, and then cover it in tape, we can use the same mechanism as fursuit makers do for the fursuit body to derive the pattern. So if you have a clay model and cover it in tape, and then mark where you want the seams to be, cut it apart at these lines, you again have a sewing pattern, a two-dimensional representation of this three-dimensional object that you can then scale up or down and use as a base for your plushie. So this is kind of like the duct tape dummy method. But again, it required a little bit of artistic talent. So to recap, the first one was, well, knowledge and experience, which we don't have yet. The second one was taking apart an existing plushie or other toy to derive the pattern, which I didn't have the heart to do. And the third one, the tape dummy, you also had to physically create a prototype model that requires a little bit of artistic talent in order to build and then derive the pattern from that. So I was also not really satisfied with this method. And then I thought, well, I'm an engineer, maybe I can just think really hard and then come up with a pattern. A question, yes?
What was the magic of buying two of them? Buying two plushies?
Two plushies, one to take apart.
Yeah, and one is exactly the victim experiment.
Yes, this would also be a way to, well, preserve at least one of them. So I wanted to have a surefire way that I can create a pattern for anything that I can imagine. So let's start very, very simple. Let's start at the basic. What if I would like to make a plushie of basically just a cube? Like something like this, very, very cute cube. So who here knows what the pattern, the sewing pattern for a cube would be? Oh, someone paid attention in geometry class. Someone just yell it. A cross or a T. I heard two different answers, and both are correct. In this case, I chose the T form. So if you unwrap a cube, you have a three-dimensional cube, and you cut some edges, and then you unroll it and have a T shape, or depending on where you cut the edges, you can also end up with a cross shape. If you have trouble imagining it, this is an animation that kind of visualizes this process of cutting apart some edges and then laying out this cube flat. So great, now we can make cube plushies. Woo! Yay! So I can probably spend all my life sewing cube plushies, but that would not be very fulfilling. So let's make something more complex. Let's make a cylinder. So who here knows what the sewing pattern for a cylinder would be? Yes. 2 circles and a square. That is, let me check. Correct. It's not quite a square, it depends on like the height of the cylinder. But yes, we have a rectangle, and attached to that are 2 circles for the top and the bottom of the cylinder. Again, if you have trouble imagining it, here's a small animation how a cylinder, and you cut it in the middle and separate the top and bottom, represents itself as a two-dimensional sewing pattern, as a rectangle with a circle at the top and the bottom. A question, yes? Dodecahedron. So I did not prepare a slide for a dodecahedron. I was so happy that I can now make sewing patterns for like cylinders that I was wondering what character can I create that is basically just a cylinder, and I am this multi-million media franchise. And before we get to the dodecahedron, let's just take what we have learned so far and maybe combine it so that we can now have a cube with like two cylinders sticking out at their arms, as arms like on the sides. So we kind of have to combine the sewing pattern of a cube with the sewing pattern of the cylinder, but we kind of need to spare some circles at the cube pattern so that we can attach the cylinders, and the cylinders are attached, so we only need one circle at the end, and in the end I think this is the sewing pattern. Like we have the pattern for the cube, but then these holes where we attach the arms, and then the cylinder patterns, but only like half of them. Oh no, I'm so sorry. Here you go.
One baby down.
Now, I managed to do that. I thought really hard, and this is the pattern for a cube with like two cylinders sticking out at the sides. Woo! And I was very happy, but it took a little bit of brain power. So let's take this one step further. Who here knows what the sewing pattern of an orca is?
Don't worry. I'm not alone.
Kinda hard, right? Okay, it's neither a cube, maybe it's a little bit of a cylinder, but it has these weird curves that are very hard to lay down flat. And then there's this eye marking that needs to be spared. And I thought very hard and tried to calculate, okay, if I have stretch of the fabric, maybe I can do it this way. But I was wishing that there was some kind of machine that is really good at maths and calculations and computations to give the pattern for me, and maybe we can call it a computer. And then I know I have a computer here, and I say, this is what I say is, that there's a method for a computer to derive a 2D sewing pattern, by the way, this is a pattern for an orca, from any three-dimensional object. And the only thing that I then need to do is what I learned by following the free patterns from Jolie Knight's website, take this pattern and assemble it into, well, an orca plushie. But now we have a problem, right? So this part is clear. After you've followed some tutorials how to make plushies, you can take a sewing pattern, follow the steps, and then have the plushie. But now you need first a 3D model in order to generate the sewing pattern. So this is our fourth method, digital unwrapping. Hello, I'm Fenmar, and welcome to my panel on how to make your own 3D models. Tricked you. Woo. So I have to admit, and I said it before, I'm not an artist, especially not a 3D artist. So if you are a 3D artist and are well versed in modeling, 3D modeling, please just close your ears, don't listen to me for the next 10 minutes, because I'll show you my process that I learned by, well, trial and error. It's quite simple and it works for me, but I'm sure there are better ways, and every time I open Blender I'm amazed how I can break it even now after 10 years. So let's stick with the orca model. The first thing before we make the 3D model is actually we get started with a 2D sketch. This is the first step in making basically anything. Even if you make your persona, you basically start with a 2D sketch. And what's important here is that it's a side view of the model, because we'll use it later as a basis to derive our 3D model. Additionally, what you need is a top view. So the same plushie, now in the top view. And it's helpful that you make sure that the front of the plushie and every single feature aligns with the side and top view. So, for example, if we look at this fin here, it's aligned in the side view and in the top view. Same goes for the marking here for the eye. These are these lines that I've added here to really illustrate. It needs to be aligned so that the side view and the top view can then be used to derive the 3D model. What I then do is I import this in a Blender. Now, I use Blender because, well, it was free. And this was the only thing that made me choose Blender. And now I know how to use it, so I continue using it. Although I'm sure there are more useful models in there. So what you can do is you can go to add and an image to reference, and then you can add your 2D images to your 3D modeling program. And what I then do is basically I trace the outline. In Blender you can create little points in 3D space, and I trace the outline of the model that I've made as 2D sketch. So here you see this little point going around the outline of the model. Still, everything you see here is two-dimensional. What you saw right here is I don't trace the outline exactly, I trace what would be in the center of the plushie. And of course, the fins here will be on the side, but not at the center of the plushie. Once I have the outline of the 3D model, I trace every seam. So for example, here the white belly of course needs to be separated from the black top. So I set some 3D points and trace wherever I need a seam to be. Again, we are still only operating in two-dimensional space here. But that's about to change, because once we have every two-dimensional seam marked, it's time to bring them into 3D. And this is where the top view comes in handy. I now take every single point that I have created in the view from the side and align it where it would be in the top view, in the three-dimensional view. And this way, I can now have an outline of all the seams in the 3D model on one side. So that's quite important that we only model one side, because we can save quite a bit of time by just doing it one side and then mirroring it. And in Blender there's this mirror modifier that basically takes care of like the second side here. And the last step then is, once we have all the seams marked, we just need to fill it in. We create additional points in 3D space that connect to the seams that we have marked and create the area of the plushie in our 3D modeling software. And you can kind of see it coming together here. Filling out all the different spaces until, well, let's speed it up a little bit more. It's kind of a time-consuming process. And I wish there would be a better way, but it's the most convenient way I have found so far. The beauty of it is you really only need a couple of operations. You need to add points in 3D space and create areas based on these points. And this is possible with basically any 3D modeling software out there. I'll spare you the rest. This is then how the finished model looks like. We still see the mirror modifier. We have now converted two 2D drawings, one from the side and one from the top, to a three-dimensional model. In this case with Blender, but you can really use any 3D modeling tool of your liking. Okay, now we have a 3D model. But there's this step missing, right? How do we now get from the 3D model to the 2D sewing pattern? And this is where I would like to introduce you to a tool that I have created that exactly takes care of this step. And this tool is called Plushify, and I will try to do a live demo. I hope this works, but let's keep our fingers crossed. So Plushify is basically just a website. You can go to plushify.net and then you can access this tool, and it's a tool to create plushie and stuffed animal patterns based on 3D models. So let's get started. Let's create a new plushie, and here we see that we use an object file. Object files are very common ways to exchange 3D models through different modeling tools. So here in Blender we have our finished orca model, and if we go to File and Export, then we will see that we can export it as this object model. Let's just do this right now, and then we can use this here to import it. And the first thing that Plushify does is it kind of shows you a lot of different options to say, okay, if you've worked with 3D models, and especially moving models from one software to another, you'll know that every software exports it differently. Like which way is up, which way is left and right. So here, this is the way to make sure that the model is correctly aligned within the tool, and you need to select the one that is placed correctly on the table. This does not really look correct, neither does this, but it looks funny, but I think this is the most correct one. And then you need to select a model that's looking towards right, which is this one. If your model has a UV map, for the expert 3D modelers, if you know what a UV map is, you can import this and use the UV map as a pattern, but since this is messed up, somehow we'll just discard it and do everything here in Plushify. So now we see the model that we have created, but of course, with just the model alone, it's quite hard to see the pattern. We need to set some seams. So let's do this. Let's create a seam from here to here, maybe. And Plushify will calculate the pattern for you. Well, this does not really look like a pattern, but we have only set one seam. So this is the most optimal pattern that you can have that represents this 3D model in 2D space most optimally. We, of course, need to set more seams. So let's separate first this tail fin from the body, and we see that we now have two pattern pieces. And if we finish this, we see, okay, this kind of looks like the fin of the tail. It's not the tail fin, sorry. How was it called? Dorsal fin, yes. Let's just set the seams here. And you can see on the left-hand side how the model changes and the pattern gets more and more representative of what the finished plushie should look like. So here, for example, we are now separating the top black part of the plushie from the bottom part. And need to, of course, how are these fins called? They are called pectoral fins, I think. And then let's just follow the seams that we set here. We have this nice shape of white that follows the body a little bit up. And just set the seam here and see how the pattern changes. Okay, are we done? No, we need to separate, of course, the eye here. That's why it's important that you set the seams in your 3D model, because right now you can only set the seams following the wireframe. Okay, and this looks like the pattern for an orca. That would make sense. If you're not sure if you're already done, you can also say show pattern quality, and then you see, okay, maybe the fluke here is not yet that optimal. It shows up in red because, of course, we have not set any seams yet. The only seams that we have set is here the connecting to the body. But of course, if you have such a wide shape, you also need seams to be here at the side. And Plushify helps you do that by just showing the pattern quality. And here we see that it gets less red as soon as we add more seams. And this looks now almost complete. Let's add a little bit more seams here for the saddle patch. And then we are done. Okay, now we have a pattern for our Orca plushie. And if we jump ahead a bit to the print section, we can see it generates a pattern, and here we have the pattern for our Orca plushie that we can print. What is this here? This looks a little bit weird to me. So what we can do is we can go to the pattern section and try to find this thing that looked a little bit weird. And it's this one here. Why does this look weird? Okay, because we forgot to set the seam back here. That's why this is a little bit an unusual shape that does not make sense to sew. So we can just amend this here and see, okay, here we go. What we also saw is in the print section here, we now have this piece here, which looks very similar to these two, and it's very hard to distinguish them. In normal patterns, you have names for the different pieces. And in Plushify, of course, you can also do that. So, for example, you can say this is the body, this is the belly. Let's do this for every piece here. This is the eye patch. This is the, how was it called? Pectoral fin. Top. And then we have, of course, also the bottom. We have the dorsal fin, I remember. Oops. We have the saddle. And we have the fluke bottom and the fluke top. And once we set all the piece names, we can see in our print that now every piece is correctly labeled. So this would be the pattern piece for the top of our pectoral fin. And we also see here in the seam allowance where we need to sew it to the other pattern pieces. So this edge here needs to be sewn to the body, and this edge here needs to be sewn to the bottom of the pectoral fin. Same for the body, where we can see, okay, here the pectoral fin is connected, or here the belly is connected. What we also need is, of course, now we have the pattern, but it really doesn't say which color do I need to cut this piece out of. So the body, of course, which was the top part, needs to be in black for our orca, while the belly would need to be in white. And this is why in the color section we can define the colors of our plushie. So our primary color, of course, is nice black, and then we can add another color which is white, and then we just set the white color to the different pieces of our plushie, and it looks much more like an orca now. And in our printout we can now see, okay, we need to cut two of the primary color for the body, but for the belly, of course, we need to cut two of the secondary color, which we could rename here to black and white. And then we see cut out of white. This looks almost like an orca, but it's still missing like the eye. There's a question, yes?
Just a quick one. Does the model have to be mirrored for this to work?
Does the model have to be mirrored for this to work? Not necessarily. You can also use Plushify to make non-mirrored models. So for example, if it's asymmetrical, some models are symmetrical, where we have details that only have at one side. What's important is, here you see the printout only contains one side of the body. And if the model is not mirrored, you will get every piece separate. So you would get a left and a right side of the body. But if they are identical, then they get merged so that you can save paper when you print the pattern.
Okay, thank you.
Awesome, thanks for the question. What's missing from this model is, well, kind of like the details that make a plushie really feel alive. The eyes or the markings. so it's quite hard to see. We see the white patch here for the eye, but we also need the information where do we need to position the applique or embroidery or however we want the eye to be represented in the model. And this is where the marking section comes into play. So here you can upload a PNG file, for example, of your eye. So just make a sketch of the eye, and then you can add it to the model. So let's click Add to Model and just add it here. Well, this looks a little bit wrong, right? Of course, the program doesn't know, well, which side is up, which side is down, which is front and back. But we can use this here to rotate and resize it, and then also to mirror it so that it shows up nicely and is aligned. And the benefit of having the model mirrored is that it immediately also shows up on the other side. So these two are linked, and if I make one eye bigger, then the other eye also gets bigger. It's really fun to play around with this, like, ooh, how crazy can I make this? But of course, if you want to make a real plushie, you should try to keep it as close to what you actually want to make as possible. And then, once you have set your markings, they also show up in the print. So here we now see, okay, the eye should be at this position, and then you can use this information from the pattern to say, when you sew it, then you can do this with applique or with embroidery. What we have seen so far is nice, but it's kind of only the same size here. So I like big plushies, some people prefer small plushies, and Plushify gives you the ability to make a plushie of any size you prefer by using this size tool. So here I have created a small living room scene where a virtual human is cuddling this orca plushie. And you can set the length, width, height. Right now it's 47 centimeters. Let's make it a little bit bigger. Let's make it 80 centimeters maybe. And then you can place it at different points in the scene, depending on where you want to display your plushie, and then make it as big as you want. For the very big plushies, I also added this point here if you just want to put it on the floor and say, like, I want a 10 meter. Good luck sewing this or stuffing it. It probably weighs a ton.
Life size.
Let's maybe keep it to a more reasonable size. I still, to be honest, it helps to have this virtual preview for me. But really, a plushie, really, to get the size, you need to see it for yourself. And that's why I also, nerd as I am, implemented an augmented reality preview where you can either with a smartphone or even a VR headset preview the size of the plushie in augmented reality. One other thing is that it also tells you how much fabric you need. So for example, if we have like the 10 meter orca, we have like 17 meters of fabric. No, thank you. But I was curious, like, this is now 100 centimeters in length, but for fabric needed, it only said like, I need 75 centimeters of black. And if you click on this inspect icon, you see the cutting layout that is recommended for this plushie. And when you make plushies, it's important that you have the fur flowing in a consistent direction. So you don't want one piece for the fur to be in the other way than the other pieces. And right now we see, okay, the fur direction is from top to bottom. So right now it flows from the top of the plushie to the bottom, but for the tail fin it's kind of the other way around. This is not consistent, this does not make sense, because we have not set this information yet. So if we can get back to the pattern, what we can do is we can set the fur direction by just drawing an arrow from front to back. And this then says, okay, I want the fur to exactly flow in this direction. And if you do this for every piece, like for the belly, and for the eye patch, and for the pectoral fin, you can also do this in the 2D preview. like you see this little red indicator that is linked between the 3D view and the 2D view. So if you are ever confused, why does this belly have this weird little shape here? You can just hover over it and then you see, okay, this is where the belly piece kind of curves up into the space of the body itself. But you can also just draw the arrow here in the 2D view. And then you set the fur direction, which is really only important for fabric calculations, and then of course in the printout it's again shown. And here we now see this is the cutting layout that is aligned with the fur direction that flows from top to bottom. And last step, of course, print. We have now set it to 100 centimeters, so there are more pages, but we can see it's scaled up the pattern, so now we need more pages to print, which I kind of don't want to show for the demonstration here, so let's get back to 60 centimeters. We see here this little indicator. So for the pectoral fin top, fabric usually has a stretch, so it indicates this is the direction where the fabric should stretch, and this is the direction of the fur, the nap of the fur. And you can use this to align your different pieces on your fabric to cut it out and then sew it together. And this is really the last step. You can print it on whatever printer you have available. If you want to make very big plushies, you can also say like, I want to print this in like A2 because then it fits on one page. But I unfortunately only have an A4 printer, so I set the page size to A4, and then you print the pattern. While we generate the pattern to print, I use this opportunity to say that Plushify is available for free. But of course it's not free for me to make because I love doing it, but I have to pay for a server and domain and development. I don't have any ads, I don't collect any data, so I plan to keep it that way. You can support me, but you don't have to. If you don't want to, you can just click this link and then you can print your pattern anyway, which is just giving you the pattern to print. You print it out. I don't have a printer configured, so I'll just save it as PDF and print it later at home. And then we are one step closer to make our own plushies. In this panel, yes, there's a question.
The program is only browser-based?
It's browser-based, yes. So you can use it on any device you have. There's no need to download anything, it's just in the browser. Yes?
Which 3D model files do you support?
Anything that can be exported as .obj. So basically every model can be exported as object file, and then you can also import it. Yes, question?
Does it require manifold models?
It's helpful if the model is manifold. Basically, the calculation is mathematical. So everything that's in the model will end up in the pattern. So what I often see is it's very tempting to just grab a model from a video game or a movie and then take this. But those models often have, for example, 24 teeth. And if you don't want to sew 24 teeth in your plushie, you need to adjust the model. So that's only the details you want it to be in the plushie are in the model. Because Plushify doesn't know, like, I want to have this and not this, you need to simplify it yourself because only you know how the plushie should look like. Yes?
Can you import embroidery files for it? Or if you have already designed eyes for the plushie?
Embroidery files are one way to create markings for the plushie. Plushify itself does not generate embroidery files from your markings. It helps you align the embroidery on the pattern, but the embroidery files themselves need to be created based on the marking in an external program. Okay, any other questions regarding Plushify or the 4 methods of how to make plushie patterns that we have covered today? The first one was just using your experience and trying what works.
Question.
Yes.
The seam allowance on Plushify,
Yes.
does it adapt to the kind of corners? So
curved corner or a sharp corner, will the seam allowance like adapt to it?
Yes, let's have a look. The question is about the seam allowance that you can set here. So right now, by default, it's set to 0.6 centimeters, or you can also set it to 2 inches, where we have like a 1/4 inch seam allowance. For the corners, the seam allowance is basically the shallow outline outside of the model itself, and it will keep consistent whatever you have set. So right now, the distance between the piece and the seam allowance is always set to 0.6 centimeters. So if we have a very sharp corner, like we have here for the dorsal fin, we see that the seam allowance is a little bit rounded in order to keep this 0.6 centimeter setting that we have created. All right.
How does the visualization of the, sorry, I forgot, back to the stretch error you had, how does it calculate? What does it show actually? Like mathematically maybe?
So you're wondering about the calculation of the pattern to incorporate stretch, or?
You had the visualization for this piece of model is badly unwrapped and
Yes.
it's still stretched. What does it do? What does it show?
Oh, this is it's a very interesting question because it's kind of very nerdy. So how does this pattern quality work? And how does it know that sometimes it's a bad quality? For example, if I remove parts of the seam here and it shows up in red. Basically what it does is it compares the shape of the pattern that it calculated for this piece with the area that is in the 3D model. So if you have a pattern piece that is very stretched in this area, where the representational area here is different from the one that is in the pattern, it shows up in red. You can also see this here. So for example, we have removed the seam that will basically make this point, and we see that this little indicator point here gets very big and stretched and distorted because this little point here in the 2D pattern needs to cover all of the area here indicated in red. And since this does not work, fabric does not stretch this way, we can calculate this and show it up here in red until you fix it and set proper patterns again. Yes?
Assuming that you have a UV map, can you import textures, or would you have to put them on the wavefront object?
If you have a UV map already, you can import it and it will use the UV map unchanged as a pattern unless you change the seams in Plushify. Textures are not imported, so you would need to extract the markings and add them separately in the markings file. Any other questions? Yes?
Earlier there was when you imported it was about the Plushie file. What is that?
Yes. When you create a new project in Plushify, like here when you say new Plushie, it says select your object or plush file. So what is a plush file? Plushify runs in the browser itself. And actually I don't collect your data. I don't even collect your models. As you saw, there's no registration step. So everything that happens here is happening on your browser and not on my servers. So if you clear your browser cache, you will lose all your models. In order to prevent this, there's a save button here where you download a .plush file. And this is the way you can back it up. You can put it on your trusted cloud storage provider, you can keep it local, and then if you ever accidentally clear your browser or have a new PC or want to move to another browser, you can just import this plush file, walk-up plush here, and it will have all your settings. So the pattern names are preserved, the size, the markings, and the colors. This is just a backup so that I don't have to collect all your data because I don't want it. Thank you. Any other questions? Yes?
There was something I thought really bit that was second pattern that is very similar but only not simulations.
I'm sorry, I think I didn't quite catch that.
Another problem that seems to semi patterns the code simulation with Sims. How to make the sync of the rules.
I know maybe what it is asking that there are some programs that will simulate how the fabric will behave when it is stuffed.
Stuffing simulation is a quite interesting question. Like, we set the seams, we have this quality preview of how good the pattern represents the 3D model. Simulating how the plushie or the model behaves once it's stuffed is then another step further of this, which Plushify right now does not support. So there's no simulation feature. There is this quality view where you can say, or where you can see, okay, this sewing pattern kind of represents the model. But of course, if we go back to the cube example and have an unwrapped cube, which is just the T, and then we stuff it, of course it will be a little bit round. This is something that is currently not possible to see in Plushify, but something that I have on my roadmap for later iterations. All right, we are getting closer to the time that we have. I want to take this opportunity to thank you all for spending time with me to learn about how to make plushie patterns. I hope one of the methods that I have shared today resonated with you, so that when you get back home after the con, you can use this, make your own plushies, and help make the world a fluffier place. Thank you.